But I think everyone in this band and people who have been and gone, so to speak, have passed through Fleetwood.
$60 million. Not stolen, not swallowed by bad investments or lawyers circling a contract. Spent, snorted, dissolved into the kind of excess that only the 1970s could manufacture and only the genuinely talented could survive long enough to regret. Mick Fleetwood carried that number for decades before saying it out loud, and when he finally did, the money turned out to be the least interesting thing he ever lost. 2 founding members gone, one to religion, one to mental illness. His marriage destroyed by a bandmate's affair. Bankruptcy so complete it stripped him of his green card. And then Christine McVie, dead in 2022. Taking with her any real chance of the band he built ever standing together again. What makes his story worth telling isn't the success. It's the fact that after all of it, he's still standing. Redruth, Cornwall, 1947, was where it started, a town so old it predates most of England's recorded history, and about as far from the world Mick would eventually inhabit as geography allows. His father was a Royal Air Force wing commander, which sounds like stability until you understand what it actually meant. Constant relocation, new schools, new languages, no roots taking hold anywhere. By age 4, the family had landed in Egypt, and Mick was there when revolution broke out in 1952 and still there during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Most children his age were learning nursery rhymes while he was absorbing the percussion of a civilization that had been keeping time since before recorded history began. Those layered rhythms of Egyptian street music entered him before he even knew what music was, and they never fully left. Norway came next, because his father had been assigned there through NATO, and so the family packed up again with Mick around 10 years old. He learned Norwegian, became fluent in it, then forgot it entirely when the next move came, but the country left something behind anyway. Those long winters, the dramatic silences, the way darkness and light traded places for months at a time, all of it fed something in him that later showed up in how he understood mood and space within rock music. Rhythm, he began to sense, wasn't only about sound, it was about what you left out. That feel for atmosphere, for the space between beats, became one of the defining qualities of his drumming throughout his career. School was its own kind of war. Severe dyslexia, in an era before anyone properly understood the condition, simply made him look slow. A boy who was clearly intelligent but couldn't perform by any conventional measure. Tests failed him. Memorization failed him. At 13, sitting under a tree with tears running down his face, he asked God to get him out of that life. And then his parents handed him a small Gigster drum kit, and something shifted permanently. Up in the attic he went. No teacher, no sheet music, no method. Just instinct and Everly Brothers records and hours of solitary practice that slowly converted frustration into something resembling purpose. Creativity ran through the whole family regardless. His father wrote poetry and played drums for fun. His sister Susan became an actress. His sister Sally turned to sculpture. At 12, Mick had already built a fake nightclub in a barn behind their house in Gloucester, set up lights, constructed a stage, and called it Club Keller. Decades later, he traced the idea for his restaurant in Maui directly back to that barn. At 15, he dropped out of school, and his family didn't fight him on it. They had watched what drumming did to him, and they believed what they saw. They bought him a better kit, and he moved to London with no money, no connections, and no plan beyond the music itself. A second-hand taxi became his transport, hauling him and his drums from gig to gig because he couldn't afford a car. And that detail matters because it tells you exactly how he operated. He didn't wait for the world to accommodate him. He built what made him useful and showed up. He slept on the floor of his sister Sally's apartment in Notting Hill and started inserting himself into London's music scene with quiet persistence. Within a year, a neighbor named Peter Bardens offered him a spot in his band, the Cheneys, and Mick was 16 years old when they began opening for the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds. A short film called Mods and Rockers in 1965 put him in front of a wider audience, and the London rock world started paying attention to the tall, gangly drummer with the instinctive sense of time. The Bow Street Runners came next in 1966, a band that had already won a national television competition to find the next Beatles, signed a record deal, and moved 20,000 copies of their debut single. A workers' strike at the record-pressing plant strangled the momentum on their follow-up just as it built. The buzz faded. Another door had opened and quietly closed. April 1967 brought the audition that repositioned everything. Mick walked into John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers terrified and walked out with the job, and playing alongside bassist John McVie now put him at a genuinely different level. Mayall's band functioned like a blues university, absorbing John Lee Hooker, Muddy Waters, learning not just technique but feel. But McVie's drinking eventually got out of hand, and Mick got pulled into the same chaos, and both were let go. That should have been a setback. Instead, it became the pivot the whole story hinged on. Guitarist Peter Green had received a small gift from Mayall around that same time, a few free hours of studio time, and he used them to record 5 songs with Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. The 5th track was a simple, unremarkable instrumental, and Green named it Fleetwood Mac almost as an afterthought, just splicing together the surnames of the 2 musicians he most wanted to keep around. That offhand decision became one of the most recognized names in rock history. Green formed the band properly in July 1967, naming it specifically to entice McVie away from Mayall's steady paycheck, and when McVie initially said no, brought in Bob Bruning as a temporary bassist. A few weeks later, McVie changed his mind. Their first show landed on August 13, 1967, at the National Jazz and Blues Festival, and their debut album, released in February 1968, reached number 4 on the UK charts without a hit single, without radio saturation, spreading entirely through word of mouth and the force of their live performances until it sold over 1 million copies in Britain on that basis alone. Danny Kirwan arrived next, 18 years old, discovered by Green playing in a boiler room, and Green was so taken by what he heard that he offered Kirwan's group a support slot, and when Kirwan's bandmates refused to go professional, Green invited Kirwan directly into Fleetwood Mac. With Green and Kirwan trading lead guitar lines, Albatross became the band's first #1 hit across Europe, and the Beatles seriously considered signing Fleetwood Mac to Apple Records before their manager turned the offer down. Christine Perfect, who became Christine McVie after marrying John, had already appeared on their recordings as a session musician, voted Best Female Vocalist by Melody Maker readers while still in Chicken Shack, and when she officially joined in August 1970, she brought something the band didn't yet have a word for: warmth. The music became more melodic without losing the depth that made them credible. But Peter Green was already gone by then. What happened to Green remains one of rock history's most painful stories. At a party at a commune in Munich in March 1970, he took LSD reportedly far stronger than anything he'd encountered before, possibly administered without his knowledge, and came back a different person. Money felt corrupt to him now, something to be returned to the world rather than kept, and he wanted to give the band's earnings away entirely. Within 2 months he had quit, and he was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and underwent electroconvulsive therapy. The man who had written some of the most beautiful blues-influenced music in British history disappeared into mental illness, and the band he had named after 2 of his closest friends had to find a way to continue without him. Then Jeremy Spencer vanished. During a U.S. tour in February 1971, he left his hotel in Los Angeles saying he was going to a bookstore and never came back, and for 5 days nobody knew where he was. The FBI eventually located him. He had joined the Children of God, a group later designated as one of the most abusive cults in American history. his head shaved and his speech a daze of repetition when the band finally found him. Bob Welch stepped in and brought an R&B and jazz sensibility that softened the band's edges and opened the music into something more expansive. Stopping was never really an option for Mick Fleetwood, and it never has been. By 1974, the internal damage had reached genuine crisis. Guitarist Bob Weston was fired mid-tour after Mick discovered he'd been having an affair with his wife, Jenny Boyd, and the rest of the tour was canceled. Mick had already been using cocaine heavily and barely present as a husband or father for long stretches, and the contradiction between his own behavior and his sense of grievance was something he wouldn't fully reckon with for years. Bob Welch quit when the tour ended, pushed past his limit by the accumulated weight of everything. The band stood closer to collapse than it ever had, and that's when Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks walked through the door and changed everything again. Fleetwood Mac's self-titled 1975 album climbed for 58 weeks before finally reaching #1 on the Billboard 200 on September 4, 1976, eventually selling more than 9 million copies in the United States alone. Nobody predicted it. And when they entered the studio to record Rumours the following year, the band was one of the most emotionally fractured groups ever to share a recording space. Mick had discovered his wife's affair. John and Christine McVie were divorcing after 8 years of marriage. Nicks and Buckingham had ended their relationship and were conducting their post-breakup warfare inside the sessions themselves. Cocaine was constant. Mick and Stevie had begun an affair during an Australian tour. Christine had started seeing the band's lighting director in full view of her ex-husband. None of that stopped the music. Go Your Own Way came out of those sessions. Don't Stop came out of them. The Chain, the only song ever credited to all 5 members simultaneously, came out of them. Dreams hit #1. Rumours sold more than 10 million copies in its first month following its early 1977 release, eventually surpassed 40 million copies worldwide, and won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year in 1978. Tusk followed in 1979, wild and deliberately strange, costing $1.4 million to record, over $6 million in today's terms. Buckingham used a Kleenex box as a snare drum on one track and sang while doing push-ups with microphones taped to the studio floor, and the title track featured Mick's tribal drumming at its most raw and unfiltered. Engineer Ken Kaylat called Buckingham a maniac. The album pushed boundaries but never came close to Rumours commercially, and left the band exhausted and further divided. Mirage in 1982 brought them back to commercial ground. It debuted at #1, and Hold Me spent 7 weeks at #4. But Buckingham was already pulling away, feeling undervalued, and when the Mirage tour ended, he was done and stayed gone until 1997. Mick's worst financial decision arrived in that same window. A 1,000-acre farm in Australia for $3 million, 8 houses, a fishing lake, an entire private world, and he lasted 3 weeks before realizing he couldn't handle the lifestyle. A $2 million advance had bought it, and another $2 million had been borrowed when that ran out. And when he went to sell, the property value had collapsed below the mortgage. Combined with cocaine spending that totaled nearly $60 million across the span of his career, the farm pushed him into bankruptcy in 1984. His green card went with it. He owed $3.7 million, more than 1.5 times his entire remaining net worth, couldn't work for 2 years, and barely remembered that period afterward. The man who had stood at the center of one of the most commercially successful bands in rock history had nothing left. Recovery came in pieces and over years. The Mick Fleetwood Blues Band formed in 2008 with guitarist Rick Vito, and their album Blue Again earned a Grammy nomination for Best Traditional Blues Album, a return to the raw, unpolished sound that had pulled him into music before the tours, before the money, before cocaine and cameras and all the rest of it. A wine label followed. He exhibited hand-painted photography in galleries across Toronto and Atlanta. Fleetwood's on Front Street opened in Maui in 2012. The dream he had traced directly back to Club Keller in that barn at age 12, and the restaurant won awards and became a local institution. In August 2023, wildfires destroyed Lahaina and took the restaurant with it in what became the deadliest wildfire in American history in more than a century. Mick flew in from Los Angeles immediately with supplies, his staff having lost their homes in the same fire that took his. Christine McVie's death in November 2022 made a full Fleetwood Mac reunion effectively impossible, and in 2024, Mick honored her alongside Hawaiian ukulele master Jake Shimabukuro on a blues album that included 2 versions of her song Songbird, played with a gentleness that made the tribute feel earned rather than performed. And then in March 2025, Lindsey Buckingham walked back into a studio with Mick Fleetwood for the first time since being fired from the band in 2018. Not for a reunion, but for Mick's solo album. Producer Carl Falk described the session as surreal. Buckingham seemed genuinely at ease. Whatever passed between them in that room hasn't been fully shared with the world, but the fact that they were there at all, after the affairs, the firings, the cocaine, the bankruptcy, the betrayals, the decades of silence, and everything those decades contained, says something specific about Mick Fleetwood that no amount of disaster has ever been able to erase. He keeps showing up. He showed up at 16 with a second-hand taxi and a drum kit. He's still showing up now at 78, and somehow, improbably, after everything, the music keeps following him there.